Hello. I was busy minding my own business working on a video about the Norwegian military, which I've been promising for a while and which a lot of you have been asking for, but then the Trump administration went and dropped a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and then a national security strategy. And I thought, okay, I got to put Norway aside for a little bit. I'll get back to it. It's not going anywhere. And I need to talk about the new national security strategy and perhaps this Monroe Doctrine. I mean, after all, I've called this YouTube channel Pax Americana, which suggests I do have an interest in the American empire. I am pro-American empire. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm for or against any particular thing. I despise jingoism. I don't like chauvinism. And, as I think I said in an early video, for me, the first law, Shirkin's first law of strategy is don't do stupid stuff. So, doing stupid things in the name of rah-rah flag waving, that's not what I'm into at all. I also want to talk about the national security strategy because I have noticed on social media that a lot of the so-called foreign policy elites, of which I guess I must say I am a member, have been dogpiling on top of it, saying this is the worst thing ever. There's been a lot of gnashing of teeth and clutching of pearls, and oh my God, the sky is falling. And anytime I see that happening, where the mob dogpiles on something, and you see these people going on about how the sky is falling, my inclination is actually just to sort of step back and run the other direction, or maybe say, hold on, guys, is the sky really falling? Should we really be dogpiling onto this? Or maybe we need to be a little bit more thoughtful before we make a decision. So I want to be open-minded about the national security strategy. So what I did is I took the time to read it, which is why I didn't immediately respond the way it seems like everybody else did. I took the time to read it and to reflect. And there are some things I like about it, some things I don't like about it, and some things I think are downright weird or possibly even scary. There's good stuff, bad stuff, and ugly, which is hence the title of this video. So what I want to do in this video is I want to go over these things and talk about what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. It's extremely helpful. And if you feel so inspired, feel free to throw some money my way, either by using the thanks button here on YouTube, or you can also buy me a coffee using the link that I put in the description below. Also, you can sign up to become a member, which would make you among the coolest people on earth, which is a really great thing to aspire to become, right? Am I right? So, all right, so let's get on to it. Part one, the good. Now, by good, I wish to include both things that I think are good and endorse, and things that I think, well, it's reasonable. I can't just get out of hand and welcome the debate. This is interesting. I might not have gone with this choice, but okay, let's talk about it. Let's have a debate about it because this is really interesting. So the very biggest example of this, and perhaps the most interesting and distinguishing feature of the national security strategy, good or bad, depending, I want to have debate, is its shift, its pivot towards not the Indo-Pacific, but the Western Hemisphere. It's interesting. Previous documents have all talked about the pivot to the Indo-Pacific. It's gone now. Now it's all about the Western Hemisphere, hence Trump's rhetoric about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, particularly, I guess, if you're not part of my American audience, and a lot of you are not American, Monroe Doctrine is something that President James Monroe came up with in 1823, in which he basically said there'll be no more European mucking about in the Western Hemisphere, and from now on, the United States is going to be the top dog, the hegemon over the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was always a weird thing. It always seemed kind of crazy and radically premature for the United States to be issuing. Because in 1823, the United States had no military power to speak of, and had very few interests beyond our own borders, and just simply wasn't in a position to be doing anything about the Western Hemisphere and doing anything about any European powers, anybody else for that matter, who wanted to muck about in the Western Hemisphere. The United States was very solidly focused on conquering and settling our own continent. And we had just enough military power to enable that, using the army to fight Indians. But that's it. We had nothing else. We had no navy to speak of, no standing army. And in reality, on the ground, concretely, what the Monroe Doctrine amounted to was actually an endorsement of the Pax Britannica. Because back in those days, the British Empire was the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere, was mucking about ceaselessly in South America and Central America and doing all sorts of things. And there wasn't a damn thing the United States could do about it, even if we wanted to. And the reality is that most of what the British were doing served American interests as well. By and large, American interests and British interests in the Western Hemisphere aligned. This is a great and wonderful thing for the United States. Why? Well, because it meant that the British could do all the heavy lifting. We didn't have to do any of it. It also meant that we didn't have to worry about the British. And just think about this, how awesome that was for the United States, that we could focus for so long on conquering and developing our own economy, our own continent, our own resources, without having to fret about defense, without having to defend the border with Canada. I mean, imagine the expense of that if we had to build fortifications and we would have had a large standing army. Imagine if we had had to have a navy large enough to take on or dissuade the British, that kind of thing. Like crazy. We didn't have to do any of that. And that's a really wonderful thing. Yay, us. But that's why it's so weird. Like, because like we couldn't do anything. To my knowledge, I'm not a U.S. foreign policy, 19th century years foreign policy expert, but I'm under the impression that the only time the United States was ever in a position to throw its weight around in the Western Hemisphere against the interests of a European power was when President Lincoln in the 1860s helped encourage the French to leave Mexico, because I believe he sent the French, who Napoleon III was mucking about. There was an empire in Mexico and doing all sorts of crazy things. Lincoln sent a message saying, get the hell out. And at the time, because it's the height of the Civil War, the United States had this gigantic military power and could have taken on France. And the French got the message, and this encouraged them to leave. I don't know if it's necessarily, I mean, they were also defeated on the ground, but right, I think the French were like, maybe we should double down here. Let's go. But then we got rid of that military power, and it's not until the end of the 19th century with the Spanish War in 1898 that the Americans really had the interest and the wherewithal in throwing a weight around in the Western Hemisphere. At least that's the way I see it. Up until that time, we just were too weak and, frankly, busy doing other things like settling our own continent, which is great. So why did Monroe do the doctrine? I don't really know. I don't know enough about the politics and domestic politics in the 1820s. Maybe somebody in the comments below can explain to me why Monroe did this, but either way, that's the doctrine. Okay, so what Trump is offering is a renewed focus on the Monroe Doctrine. That's not what I would have gone with, but I can't say categorically that it's bad. It's interesting, it's debatable, and it also kind of makes sense in some regards. For example, if you think about the sorts of issues that affect Americans in their day-to-day lives, what affects us? And often world affairs, the things that go on, are sort of, the things that are at stake are abstract and don't necessarily affect us. But if you think about what affects us day to day, as I go out and about and wander around the neighborhood, it's two things. Well, migration is the first thing. The second thing is, although it doesn't affect me, but it does affect many, many people in the larger community, is drugs, like the narcotics problem, the opioid epidemic. These are real things. These are things that come out of the Western Hemisphere. These are Western Hemisphere issues. This doesn't have anything really to do with China or Europe or Russia or great power competition or anything like that. This just has to do with problems that are kind of indigenous to the world below our border with Mexico. So if you're trying to craft a strategy or a foreign policy that really answers to the concrete reality of your average American, why not, right? The Monroe Doctrine kind of makes some sense. Like this makes sense in terms of what are our interests, where these are our interests, and these are our primary interests. And there's this whole statement in the Trump's national security strategy about what our interests are, what are our vital interests, and it's really hard to argue with them because they're about our health, our safety. We don't want people messing with us. We want to do something about the narcotics thing. It's all sort of real stuff. And then if you're trying to deal with the world of the real rather than theoretical, then you could see that the Western Hemisphere maybe requires more attention. The other thing that I think that the Trump national security strategy rightly says is it talks about how the American foreign policy establishment for decades, well, since forever, has judged that migration and drugs have been manageable problems and relatively inconsequential, such that we can focus our attentions on other global problems. Trump is basically saying, not so fast. These are consequential. And guess what? We've done a terrible job of managing these things up until this point. And it's hard to argue against that. Now, we might have differences about migration policy and immigration policy, et cetera, but it is a mess, right? And narcotics is a serious problem. Now, again, also with narcotics, there are also things that can be said about narcotics and what's the best thing to do about it. For reasons I can't possibly explain, I've been sort of obsessed with these YouTube channels that do interviews with fentanyl addicts on the streets of Kensington, Philadelphia. And the interviews are, I mean, it's often brutal stuff. But among the things that these interviews demonstrate very clearly is that these addicts have lots and lots of problems. And simply cutting off the supply of a certain kind of drug doesn't necessarily going to solve any of their problems. Chances are they're just going to move on to some other drug. And getting them off the streets and helping them deal with their addiction is going to require treatment programs that are of a scale and of a quality that simply don't exist these days. Okay, so there's this whole debate about treatment versus enforcement, all this sort of stuff. That's way beyond my expertise, so I don't want to get into this in this video. But let me just say that at a very basic level, I would agree with the Trump administration that drugs and narcotics is a serious problem. What to do about it, we can debate, but it is a serious problem. Same thing with migration. What do you do about that? We can debate, but it's a real thing. Immigration affects all of us. Every time I go out into the street or go to a gas station or 7-Eleven, I'm dealing with immigrants all the time. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Most of the time the vast majority of the time, I find that my interactions with these immigrants is perfectly pleasant and fine and positive, and I'm okay with it. But it's a thing. It's a real thing that I can't pretend is of no consequence to my life. So Trump, I think, is kind of hitting the right note there. More things that I want to put in the good column. The national security strategy calls for downplaying the importance of the Middle East in American policy. Basically, the idea is that because we are less dependent on energy, on the oil and gas that comes out of the Middle East, we should care less about what goes on and get less involved. And this is also a reason for doing more to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern energy. The less dependent we are on energy from the Middle East, the less we need to care about what happens there, and less involved we have to be in what happens in that part of the world. I think that's an awesome idea. I hardly endorse these ideas. I mean, when you look at the way the desire to keep cheap oil coming out of the Middle East and out of the Persian Gulf has so distorted American foreign policy for the last, well, I guess ever since World War II. I mean, it's really appalling in the way it's distorted and it formed our relations with the Gulf states and these kingdoms and, right, the Iraq wars. Like, come on. I mean, I endorse this. I think this is great. And if it does mean doing more energy production in the United States, yeah, I don't have a problem with that either. So I'm going to put this under the good category. I would also add that in general, I like the emphasis that the national security strategy places on promoting American interests and looking after ourselves and our own interests before other people's interests. And I think that it's true that previous administrations, ever since World War II, have been remarkably overly indulgent of countries and multinational organizations, many of which we created, of their actions that are against American interests, that they do things that are against our interests, that these organizations have done things that are against our interests. And we kind of put up with this side of the sense of noblesse, or the sense of like, oh, we don't, it doesn't really matter. Look at the United Nations, which we created. We created the United Nations. It exists because of the United States, and often it does things that are contrary to American interests. Now, the reason why we did this in the immediate aftermath of World War II is it's really very noble, because what the United States did at the height of its economic and military power, the immediate aftermath of World War II, is basically said, we agree to cede some of our power and some of our sovereignty to these multinational institutions because it's in the interest of the whole. This is for the greater good. It's remarkably noble, and I think it's something that distinguishes the American empire from its predecessors, the Pax Americana from some of the previous empires. The fact that we could have taken a very different approach in 1945, 1946, because we had all the power and all the money. We did it out of the sense of right and wrong and ability. This is great. But that being said, you could also argue that there are lines that maybe people go too far, or we allow institutions or different countries to go too far. And Trump is signaling, let's not do that anymore. And I can't disagree with that. What that might look like in detail, that's another issue. But as a general principle, I can't disagree with that. I also like the national security strategy's emphasis on the American worker and on American jobs. I agree with its criticism. There's a criticism in the NSS about how previous administrations have encouraged the deindustrialization of the United States, have worked with run with this theory that by enriching China, that will be in our interests. And I think that notion has been proven false and is in fact boomeranged against us. I think that the way the American elites, and I hate to use that word, I'm going to talk about that in this video, there's this consensus in the United States that free trade is good, but the consensus, it feels more like a religious dogma to me than anything else. That and maybe it's because I read too much Marx, right? The way Marx talks about free trade is that it just furthers the commodification of labor, but it also it starts with the assumption that what's good for the whole is what's really good for the capital, for the rich people who can invest in the stock market and who can benefit. So if you offshore a factory, this is good for the stocks of the company, right? The people who invest in it, but not necessarily on the people who work for the company, that kind of thing, right? Is it in our interest? It's like we invited China to eat our lunch, and then steal the recipe for our lunch, and then buy the restaurant in which we're eating. This is a real problem. Does it really serve our interests? And I don't know. I think the only real clear benefit of deindustrialization and offshoring is the fact that we have effectively offshored our industrial pollution. As a result, the waterways and the air of the United States is probably cleaner than it's been in a very, very long time, because all the pollution is somewhere else, like in China. So, yay us. Now, that being said, the rhetoric in favor of the American worker that you see in sort of the Trumpist documents like the National Security Strategy, often is not matched by reality. And this is a part of the problem with the Trump administration, but really all administrations, is that this, yes, but what about, right? So we're going to put the interest in the American workers first. Great. But then when you look in details, you think, like, is that true? Is that what's really, really, really going on? So, for example, tariffs hurt the American workers because tariffs make everything expensive. Tariffs, in theory, are going to help create jobs in the United States. Is that true? Has it actually happened? And have the benefits outweighed the costs? It's really hard to say. I don't really know. Also, I believe if you're serious about reindustrialization, that's going to require certain things that I don't see being done, certain kinds of like investment policies, industrial policies, things to encourage investment, encourage the retraining, encourage the professional education. There's so many things that you have to do to make it possible for, let's say, if Apple really wanted to make iPhones in the United States. It's easier said than done. They don't have the industrial engineers. They don't have the ability. Never mind the sourcing the parts. It's just a question of, do you really have people who are capable of doing this kind of work? To get it, you can't just put tariffs on the Chinese-made stuff. You also have to help nourish available labor that can do this kind of work, etc. So it's an incomplete policy, and it's often an incoherent policy, even if in principle I endorse the intent that you find in the National Security Strategy. Also in the good column, although you have to be careful here, the National Security Strategy calls for pragmatism, being pragmatic, but not making an ideology of it. Also being realistic, but not falling prey to realism. Realism is something that I'm always suspicious of. Frankly, I'm suspicious of anything that comes out of international relations scholarship. I generally have a lot of disdain for the entire field. I mean, one of the things I notice about realism and realist theory is that if you lined up every realist international relations scholar end to end, you'll never reach a consensus about what it actually means. And constantly they're defining it because they always discover that their definition doesn't actually work. Well, you have to understand, it's really this, it's really whatever. It's kind of silly. But there's this idea that you see in the NSS, this idea of stepping away from isms in ideologies and just trying to be pragmatic and trying to have a common sense approach to things. There's also a sense of not wanting to have values and idealism take the fore in guiding our foreign policy. So we shouldn't be hectoring other countries about how they live their lives and how they govern themselves. But also we can't renounce values. And this is where the NSS tries to say there's a balance to be drawn, and it's not calling for the renunciation of values and ideals, it's just for rebalancing. And I guess I agree with that. But I'm really worried because I think it's a slippery slope. It's too easy. It's easy to go from saying, all right, it's unrealistic, it's not helpful for idealism to guide our foreign policy, to slip into the sort of cynical, we have no values, right? There are no good people or bad people. There's just business. It's all just sort of interest. And then you can kind of become cynical, and then you can go too far. So, but in and of itself, this idea of rebalancing is not something that I disagree with, particularly because I do find that values-based or idealism, or the idealistic approaches to foreign policy are just not realistic. And I don't think they get as far, although they might be very satisfying, perhaps, for its proponents, because we can feel good about ourselves because we're engaged in the right kind of virtual signaling, even if we're not actually affecting any improvement on the ground. Part 2, the bad. A corollary to the national security strategy's embrace or re-embrace of the Monroe Doctrine is the administration's abandonment of the paradigm of great power competition. Now, maybe this is something I could put in the good column, would say it's like I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's interesting, and we should debate about it. But I think it's more bad than good, so I'm going to put it here in the bad column. I do think that we need to debate whether or not the great power competition paradigm is a useful one, it's a healthy one. I think that needs to be said. I think one of the problems with the great power competition paradigm is that it can blind us to things that are really important, or blind us to things that perhaps are more important than the great power competition. It reminds me of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we suffered from a monomania. We were so obsessed with the Soviet Union that this made us blind to things that were going on all over the place that we either dismissed as unimportant or we just didn't even see it all. And it led us to do things like cozy up with people whom we shouldn't have cozied up to, just because they made sense. Doing so made sense in terms of our campaign against the Soviet Union. I'm thinking of like the Soviet Mujahideen or Pakistan during that era, right? We helped cultivate groups that eventually became Al-Qaeda because these people were enemies of the Soviets. Were they our friends? Hardly. Does this come back to haunt us? Absolutely. But for the most part, in the Cold War, that's all we could see. It was just, are they good or bad, with good or bad being defined by where they stood vis-a-vis us and the Soviet Union. That's very problematic. Global power competition, even though we've expanded from us versus the Soviets, is a little bit broader than that, but it still is a similar problem. Like if we look at Africa, for example, and all we see is great power competition, we only see Africa through the lens of great power competition, the likelihood is much greater if we become blinded to things that are really important. And also it means we're not seeing Africa for themselves, or Africa qua Africa, or Africans on their own basis. They're just sort of the theater of a war between us and China or something like that. And I can't see how that's a constructive thing to do. So, okay, not all bad, not in principle bad, but when you look at the way it's expressed in the national security strategy, it's expressed in two ways. First of all, China is acknowledged, but the threat of China, the way it talks about China, is markedly different from the way you would see it in other documents, where China is no longer the pacing threat or a great rival. It's just sort of like it's an economic competitor. It's much more a competitor. And we need to be worried about this because we need to make sure that the Chinese can't cut off our access to the South China Sea or take over or diminish our access to strategic minerals and to our supply chains that we need for our industry. But there's not that much talk about China in this whole thing. It's really interesting. It gets worse, though, when it talks about Russia, because the national security strategy basically dismisses Russia as a serious threat in any way, shape, or form. And it goes further than that. The national security strategy makes clear that the threat in Europe is not Russia. No. The threat is the European Union. The European Union is a threat because the European Union is undermining the viability and the confidence of European sovereign nation states and is making the Europeans weak and making them lose confidence. And according to the national security strategy, the problem isn't, again, it's not Russia. It's not that Russia invaded Ukraine, is trying to destroy Ukraine, or is trying to have this revision, is trying to rebuild the Russian Empire or anything like that. No. The problem is that Europeans, because they perceive themselves as weak, are freaked out about the Russian threat. And that's the real danger here. It's not Russia, it's the Europeans and their overreaction to the Russian threat. According to the national security strategy, what the Europeans need to do is get a grip, calm down, be more confident about their own strength, and thus they would no longer freak out about the Russians. They would no longer fret, and everything would be fine, because that means that the risk of a conflict with Russia would be much reduced. And then our relationship collectively with Russia would stabilize, because the objective here is stabilizing the relationship with Russia. It's not Russia that's threatening the stability of the power dynamics. It's the Europeans, because of lack of confidence, that are threatening the instability of the security system. Totally bizarre. Now, there's a little bit of truth in this, in the sense that, yeah, the Europeans are really insecure, and I guess this is a result of their 80-year dependency on the United States for their own security. The reality is that Europeans, especially collectively, have the economic and military might to throw Russia around like a rag doll. They could totally take on Russia, no problem. They have enough tanks, enough planes, etc. They have the industry. It's not a problem. But they feel insecure in part because they're not acting together. They haven't, it's like they waste a lot of effort. They waste a lot of money. So there's some truth to this, but also it seems to me that the answer isn't weakening, let's say, the European Union in favor of these independent nation sovereign states. It's rather strengthening the European Union, because it's only collectively that European countries have the power to deal with Russia and to shrug off the Russians, not individually as separate states. The whole thing about the European Union is really part of some very strange kind of rhetoric and ideology that you find in the national security strategy that is hostile towards what I'm going to call liberal culture. And now this brings us to the ugly, part 3. In the national security strategy, there are things that I think are at very best weird and often quite ugly, and things that are ugly because what I hear are echoes of illiberal far-right politics and the fascist regimes in the mid-20th century. What am I talking about? For one thing, the national security strategy frequently evokes the specter of elites with their globalist agenda. All right, as always, there's always some truth to that, right? Because you could talk about like the foreign policy blob in the United States and the elites, people like me with a fistful of Yale degrees and my Brooks Brothers jacket, and the fact that so many of us have sort of a consensus about certain kinds of things, right? And maybe we're out of touch with the masses of America, maybe, right? But the rhetoric about the elites, the rhetoric about elites and globalists, so often in history is the stuff of, first of all, it's the stuff of populist politics everywhere. That's true. But it's also the stuff of very toxic, illiberal politics. I'm going to give you an example to make this clear. Very, very often, anti-elite, anti-globalist rhetoric really ends up being anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not here to say that the national security strategy is anti-Semitic. That would be absurd. But if you look at this historically, and you look at different countries, France and Germany and the US also, and everywhere in the world, really, very often, illiberalism and anti-Semitism go hand in hand. The one is a cover for the other, or the one is instrumentalized by the other. So I'm not saying this is bad for the Jews or anything like that. It's rather the presence, the functional presence of anti-Semitic rhetoric, the discourse, the grammar, is a signal. It should alert everybody to the illiberal nature of the larger politics. So this might have nothing to do with Jews. It might never lead to the targeting of Jews. Let's never mind that. It's about illiberalism and a critique of liberal politics. I think fundamentally, liberal politics are what makes the West the best. It's why I like the Pax Americana, because fundamentally, more often than not, it tends to espouse liberal politics, certainly far more than the alternatives to the American imperium, which I think tend to be very, very illiberal. Look at China. Liberalism is good. I don't mean Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi liberalism. I mean like classic liberalism that emerged in the Enlightenment throughout the 19th century, the liberalism of the Founding Fathers and Madison, Monroe, and the British constitutionalism, that kind of thing. This is all good stuff. But the anti-elite rhetoric, anti-globalist rhetoric, it's very, very corrosive. It's very poisonous. It promotes this dividing between real and true Americans or French people or Brits or whatever, and these sort of like nefarious, unpatriotic, traitorous outsiders who are actively working against the interests of the true Americans or French or British or what have you. It's really very toxic and really very dangerous. This ends up with persecution. Somebody's going to get persecuted as a result. This goes This doesn't end well. It never ends well. It either ends nowhere because it's of inconsequence. And fortunately, in America, in American history, we've had our share of very liberal political groups, far left and far right, but they tend not to have gotten very far and not infected the mainstream. Whereas in other places, like in France, they affected the mainstream in terms of like Vichy, or there did periods of time in many countries where the illiberalism wins out over the liberal center. Germany, of course, is a classic example. What we see in this national security strategy is the more of the entry, more of the penetration of very illiberal politics, or let's say illiberal adjacent, because it's not, we're getting close, into the mainstream of American political discourse. Because now it's part of our national strategy. How does illiberalism feature as a part of our national strategy? We see the same thing in the rhetoric about Europe that we find in national strategy. The national security strategy talks about Europe in this really weird way. It smells of illiberalism, because there's this critique of European liberalism, European liberal values, and it clearly endorses far-right nationalist European politics. Very interesting. So why are we dismissing Russia while saying that the real threat are European liberals and European liberal politics? We are endorsing far-right politics in Europe. What's that all about? This is, to me, extremely, extremely dangerous. I am not comfortable with this at all. I mean, also, it has to be said, one of the weird things about the whole anti-elite discourse that one finds in American politics, among other places, is that very often it's being espoused by people who are themselves elite, right? Because so elites have caught on to the idea that bashing the elite is profitable. I mean, there's so many people today in the American public sphere, people who really clearly are elites, just look at their resumes and where they went to school, that kind of thing, who are like leading the front in the sort of bashing of the elites. And it's like, whom are you kidding? And of course, there's Donald Trump, a very wealthy man who inherited his wealth. Who's not elite there? Or J.D. Vance, right, who went to Yale Law School, which is as elite gets in the United States. Or, and he's said to be the creature of, what's his name, Thiel, who is himself like this billionaire who he went to Stanford, where I also went, but I seem to have skipped the class or missed out on the class on how to be a billionaire, and then went to Stanford Law, and was able to bring Vance into this very privileged world of Silicon Valley venture capitalism, and these elites who are enriching elites and investing in other elites, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, who are you trying to kid? Like, how does any of these people become the spokesperson for the working class? But they make this claim and people accept it. Now, we're on the subject of illiberal politics. There's I want to signal this one passage here, which I find very curious, particularly its presence in a national security strategy. It says, finally, we want the restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health, without which long-term security is impossible. We want an America that cherishes its past glories and its heroes, which I guess is why we are removing things like displays about African Americans who fought in the military, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? And also why we are reverting back to the names of Confederate generals, like our bases back to the names of Confederate generals, because now we're going to celebrate them rather than talk about how bad they were. And that looks forward to a new golden age. We want a people who are proud, happy, and optimistic that they will have their country, that they will leave their country to the next generation better than they found it. We want a gainfully employed citizenry, sounds great, with no one sitting on the sidelines who takes satisfaction from knowing that their work is essential to the prosperity of our nation and to the well-being of individuals and families. Great. This cannot be accomplished without growing numbers of strong traditional families that raise healthy children. Okay, very Vichy, all right, but what exactly does that mean, and how do you actually achieve that? If that's our end state, what are the means that you use to create that? Strong traditional families, because now we get into like Christian value stuff, and of course, gay marriage is bad. And then by healthy children, based on what we've seen from the Trump administration, I think that means that we're raising our kids drinking unpasteurized milk and certainly not giving them vaccinations. That's how we get healthy children. It's really very odd. It's Vichy. It's weird. And I don't understand really why this is part of the national security strategy. Maybe appropriate for some sort of Sunday sermon, I suppose, in certain circles, but it's just kind of weird in a official U.S. government doctrine. I really hope you like this video. Thank you very much. Like I said before, please hit like and subscribe. If you look in the description, you'll find links to my social media, my Blue Sky, my Twitter, and LinkedIn, also my own website, michaelshirk.com, and also my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. Stay tuned. There's a lot in the pipeline, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.